Hello and welcome to this week's Law and Technology. This week we're going to ask, does an IP address identify an individual? In 2011, a New York father awoke to hear knocking at the kitchen door of his house. He got up out of bed and went downstairs, only to find armed tactical police pointing weapons at him. He was ordered to lie down on the floor, and even as he tried to ask what was going on, police called him a pedophile and accused him of committing disgusting sexual crimes against children. How had police come to be in his house? Well, images of children had been distributed from a computer. The application used to share those images provided police with an IP address as the source IP address for those images. And our New York father was identified from records of his internet service provider as the subscriber using that particular IP address. An arrest warrant was issued in his name, and the rest, as they say, is unfortunately history. Now, it would be unfair to simply single out the police officer in charge and blame them for any errors or misconceptions in the cyber investigation that had led them to being in this New York kitchen. The widespread misconception is that all IP addresses are unique and can be used, for example as seen here, to identify the individual computer user and hack their system to steal their money or data. It's also claimed that IP addresses directly identify the person responsible when an illegal act involving computers has occurred. We even find this misconception being promulgated in academic literature. And it has been used repeatedly as the method copyright holders have relied upon to identify defendants when bringing cases against alleged file sharers, whether for illegally sharing music and movies or other more serious materials. The IP address of our New York father's computer was what led police to be in his kitchen. But what is an IP address? The Internet Protocol, or IP address, that is most common, and that we will be referring to today, is based on IP version 4. It is expressed as a set of 4 numbers, such as 203.114.76.2. In recent years, however, a new version called IPv6 has been introduced that uses up to 32 characters. But as you can see, it's a lot longer and a lot more complicated and far less memorable. Hence, while IPv6 is ratified and has seen some use, it hasn't really taken off with consumers. We won't be discussing IPv6 addresses today, because it's quite unlikely that you'll be dealing with one of those when prosecuting or defending your client. That said, everything in this talk applies equally to either type of IP address. The IP address is a string of characters that is a numeric label used to identify the network interface of a computer that's currently connected to a network. Humans are very good at remembering groups of words. So, for example, you know that Google is www.google.com, or www.sra.org.uk will get you to the Solicitors Regulation Authority. However, we humans don't tend to be anywhere near as good at remembering the numbers that actually correspond to the computer addresses for those websites. Our computer looks those addresses up for us. It uses another system to identify the strings of numbers that correspond to the IP addresses of those servers. For example, here we have 4 people's computers that are connected directly to the internet. Barry decides to go to the Solicitors Regulation Authority website to look up a practice note. He enters www.sra.org.uk into his web browser, and the browser uses protocols that are built into the computer to request the IP address of the SRA's website, returning 104.17.0.138. His computer requests the SRA website from that IP address. Now, if Yvonne, who also wanted to request the SRA website at the same time, decided to, the SRA's web servers would know which request was which simply by looking at the IP address of the requesting computer, whether hers or Barry's, and it would return the requested information to the correct IP address. IP addresses are broadly divided into two types: private and public. Private addresses are those you will more commonly see distributed by your home or office internet router to your computing devices, and they fall into the following IP address ranges. Your internet router and internet core systems generally do not allow these private IP address ranges direct access to the internet. Conversely, public IP addresses are pretty much every other available IP address and are able to connect to internet systems. All of this is why if you open Google and search for "what is my IP address," even though all of your connected devices at home will have unique private IP addresses from your router, Google will report them as having the same public IP address, the public IP address of your internet router. IP attribution occurs when we seek to identify the responsible individual using the IP address from which a cyber-enabled or cyber-dependent crime is believed to have originated. It is a common misconception that every device on the internet has a unique IP address. Further, it's been wrongly claimed in numerous court proceedings that this IP address reliably identifies the individual who was using that device. This is the mistaken belief that an IP address equals a human. But this is not true. An internet-facing IP address identifies a device, most often the router in your home or office. This device acts as a gateway, sharing access to the internet with numerous user devices, including phones, tablets, laptops, and gaming consoles. While these routers provide often temporary but unique IP addresses to each device, these addresses are normally from internal or private IP address ranges that cannot be used directly on the internet. Internet traffic from these devices appears to other internet systems and servers as having originated from the router. In this way, it can be difficult or impossible from the perspective of the public internet to identify with absolute certainty from the potentially large group of user devices within your home or office, and hence the individuals using them, which individual a given item of internet traffic originated from. When a gateway device such as your router shares its internet connection with a group of devices to which it has assigned private, non-internet routable IP addresses, we call this Network Address Translation, or NAT for short. As the number of devices on the internet using IP addresses has grown, the pool of available addresses has begun to dry up. We have sought global solutions to solve this address shortage that include larger and more confusing addressing schemes like IPv6 and expansion of the use of private IP address ranges into the service provider's own network. When NAT is used within the service provider network, we call this Carrier-Grade Network Address Translation, or CGNAT. With CGNAT, the ISP or phone company's equipment, in this case the cell phone tower, has the public internet-facing IP address, and it issues temporary addresses from a private IP address range to the cell phone company's subscribers. Now consider the following example where you are an Uber driver, and as part of the service you provide, you allow your passengers to connect to the Wi-Fi hotspot that is part of the infotainment system of your new car. Many new cars come equipped with 4 or 5G routers that connect the car's infotainment system to the internet via the vehicle manufacturer's chosen cell phone service provider. In our scenario, the vehicle receives a CGNAT IP address from the service provider. Because the vehicle acts as a Wi-Fi hotspot to the occupant's cell phone and tablet devices, it too provides private IP addresses that are local to the vehicle's own Wi-Fi network. Now, in and of itself, this adds a further layer of obfuscation to network traffic. Traffic from one private address network range, that's the one that's used by the devices, passes through the vehicle's router and is translated into another private address network range before being transmitted to the service provider's tower and translated into the public IP address of that tower. One cell phone tower might be sharing its public-facing IP address with more than 100 subscribers. Now, the final part of this scenario is this. You've been a prolific Uber driver, having transported many passengers from place to place, and many of your passengers have used your infotainment system's Wi-Fi. One afternoon, you're parked up at the supermarket waiting for your spouse to return with that carton of milk or loaf of bread that you desperately needed on the way home. Unbeknownst to you, one of your former passengers is sitting on a seat out front of the supermarket using his phone. His phone sees the open Wi-Fi hotspot of your car and automatically connects, getting a private IP address from your car's router. He opens a website and begins to chat with an underage girl, asking her to meet him later that day for sex. The underage girl, though, is in fact a police officer who gets an immediate warrant for the app provider to provide the IP address where the chat messages were coming from. They also get warrants from the service provider to identify the subscriber details, and in your case, the car manufacturer to identify you from your vehicle registration details. The app provider returns the IP address of the cell tower. The service provider checks the logs of that cell tower and returns the CGNAT IP address and the IMEI subscriber number of your car. The vehicle manufacturer provides the VIN number, which police can then use in real time to get your registration details from the DVLA. Police arrive and arrest you for grooming a child under the age of 16. This scenario is consistent to that of our New York father, for reasons which I am now going to explain. IP addresses feature heavily in cases involving claims of alleged hacking, online bank fraud, child pornography, and even online stalking. The misunderstanding that an IP address equals a person is often seen in the court transcripts and judgments, just like the one shown here. Now, returning to the New York father we discussed earlier, in his case, police forensically searched his computers and were unable to locate any of the alleged offensive child pornographic material. Police later found that a 25-year-old neighbour had gained access to and was illicitly using the father's wireless internet connection. The neighbour's computer contained many thousands of illegal images, and he was prosecuted for the crime. The individual discussed in the article shown here was also identified as having distributed child porn based solely on an IP address identification. His case, like that of our New York father, was dropped after police failed to find any evidence of the infringing material on his personal computer. Similar scenarios have played out again and again in the United States, United Kingdom, and many other countries. Just like a small number of US-based law firms, including Prenda Law and Alpha Law Group LLC, UK law firm ACS Law became notorious as a copyright troll who would identify alleged peer-to-peer copyright infringers through their IP address. In early 2010, ACS Law issued 10,000 dunning letters in the UK. This act would be the beginning of the end for the law firm. Within 2 years, the main partner was suspended from practice by the Solicitors Disciplinary Tribunal and ordered to pay over £76,000 in costs. A later Which investigation concluded that identification by IP addresses was unreliable and that innocent people had been accused. Two issues arise with this type of civil copyright infringement by IP address identification model. First, this method targets ISP account holders on the circumstantial basis that their IP address was found by sometimes questionable software tools to have been accessing or sharing music or videos on a file sharing website. However, copyright trolls like ACS Law were always less interested in performing the due diligence required to ensure that the ISP's named customer was in fact the individual responsible for these actions. Second, we do have to question the professional ethics of any lawyer involved in this type of business model, whose business practice is similar to that of spammers. They send out thousands of letters with sometimes questionable claims and incurring no real cost to themselves, while being entirely happy to collect a large slice of the income that's generated when the small percentage of recipients, guilty or innocent, pay up. To answer our original question regarding whether an IP address identifies a human, given that IP addresses don't equal a human, it's safe to say they don't automatically identify one either. However, that isn't to say that an IP address could not, when combined with other evidence, be persuasive in establishing that a particular person, using a particular computer at a particular time, may have in fact performed a particular act. Now, we should be careful not to apportion or assign blame. It's possible that some of the police and academics and lawyers involved in these and similar cases had the best of intentions going in, but that their words, combined with the technical nature of the subject matter, were simply a result of their own misunderstandings. The important message here is that when prosecuting or defending a case where the primary evidence that has been used to identify the defendant is an IP address, dig deeper, look harder, and take care. An IP address does not equal a human, and there may be any number of reasons why this particular IP address has been identified that have little or nothing to do with the individual in front of you.